And a voice. Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Jay. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the executive assistant here at the Berkman Klein Center. Every Wednesday, we host top academics, industry experts, tech professionals to share their cutting edge research at the edge of issues like AI, social media, digital rights, and more. Today, we are so excited to be hosting Mackenzie Arnold, who is the director of US policy for the Institute for Law and AI, an independent think tank that provides an analysis and advice to make sure that advances in AI benefit the public at large. His personal research focuses on administrative law, agency decision-making, and liability practices. Today, he's going to be talking a little bit about how governments and companies can navigate the often very deep uncertainty around governing AI, walking a fine line between regulatory skepticism, we don't know enough, we can't start regulating yet, and regulatory prescriptivism. We know sufficiently, we can start regulating right now. And that middle line is something he calls radical optionality, and I'm going to let him explain a little bit more about that today. But thank you for joining us, and please join me in a round of applause for Mackenzie Arnold.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me? Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks so much to the Berkman Klein Center for having me here today. I also owe thanks in advance to my colleagues Christoph Winter and Charlie Bullock, who came up with the radical optionality meme itself and have been doing extensive work on this. They'll be publishing a piece in the near future, and I draw extensively on that work and our conversations in preparing today's presentation. Great. All set with the slides? Thanks. Okay. So as Jay said in the beginning, the topic today will be radical optionality, a governance strategy for managing uncertainty. One moment, just no problem.
There we go. That's fine.
Okay. I think we're in business. Okay, so continuing on. Today's conversation, I'm going to make 4 key points, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end. Sort of setting the stage, one of my core claims is that uncertainty is the key design consideration or constraint on AI policy. Now, I'll get into a little bit more nuance on that in the presentation. There's some chance that even a narrower proposition that just it is one of the considerations is enough to do the work here. But essentially, there's a lot of disagreement over what we should expect in terms of benefits and risks from AI systems. There's considerable disagreement on what the best practices are to mitigate those risks. And under those conditions, it's really hard to come to some sort of consensus, either empirically or politically, in terms of policy. Now, one thing, the second claim I'm going to go through today is that uncertainty doesn't necessarily need to lead to inaction. In fact, uncertainty is a strong reason for doing at least some preparation, right? To gather the information and build the expertise such that at some future point in time, you can better answer questions that today you're not prepared to do so. And that leads into optionality, right? That preparing yourself with the information and expertise to make informed decisions in the future is both a wise decision and overall a strong guiding principle for thinking about the law and policy questions that we should be researching and developing. Now, one of the advantages of optionality, as I've already mentioned, is that it addresses this uncertainty question, right? It has epistemic and reasoning benefits that help us make better decisions in the future. But it also deals with those tricky political considerations. When you can't get people to agree on the types of risks or the types of mitigations that you can take, they often will be able to agree that you need to at least measure some core things, you need to share information, you need to have competent people to make decisions. And last, and hopefully I'll just show this in the presentation, I think lawyers are particularly well positioned to investigate many of the questions related to this optionality portfolio. So jumping right in. Now, what do I mean when I say that there is considerable uncertainty around future AI progress? Well, there's a couple things. On the most foundational level, we have uncertainties about what those future capabilities might be, right? And there's a large range of what they might be. On one end, some people think that, in essence, future AI systems will look much like the ones that we have today. They'll maybe produce marginal productivity gains and be integrated into maybe some toy problems or minor industries, but they won't really change things. On the other end of the spectrum, there's some thought that AI systems could be widely deployed across the economy and could in fact change the very nature of how we work, how we live, how we govern ourselves. Now, that's considerable disagreement both on the domains where we might expect AI to be important and on the magnitude of those effects. There's also considerable disagreement on what we should expect the trajectory of future AI progress to be, right? There's questions about how fast we should expect, for example, agents that can do a wide variety of tasks and be tool integrated to be released to the market or meaningfully integrated into real economic activities. There's also questions about how large a barrier that integration will be. Will it ultimately be that manufacturing and robotics and other things are a key bottleneck that means that AI progress lags by years or decades? Or will we be able to work around those problems with some of the advances that we get in future AI systems? There's even questions as to whether we're in the right paradigm right now. It could be possible that simply scaling training compute and inference compute is enough to get us to really capable models, or that some amount of scaffolding or other sort of integration techniques will be enough to get us there. And there's another chance that we've yet to make some of the foundational discoveries that will be necessary. Now, that's not just important as an academic point. It affects what we would project to be the actors that are relevant in the future. If we're talking about the current paradigm and that's how we get to transformative systems, we might already know who the relevant actors are, and there might be a relatively small class of them. If instead we're in a new paradigm, or if in fact inference scaling is significant, we might have far more actors, or ones that aren't on the radar right now. There's also considerable uncertainty when it comes to mitigations. Even for AI harms that are happening right now that we can observe in areas like medicine or labor, it's really hard to measure them, and we don't have agreed upon best practices for how to handle them. There are some exceptions to that. Cybersecurity, for example, is one domain that's sort of receptive to tight feedback loops. It's developed over a period of time. If you put a bunch of cybersecurity experts in a room, you might be able to get some effective best practices. But in many areas, we don't yet know what the best mitigations will be. Making this even more complicated, there's considerable spillover effects that might end up swinging the balance of a policy from positive to negative or the other way around. You might think that heavily regulating a technology in one context prevents certain risks in the short term, but it might have effects on our overall national security or competitiveness with other nations like China. It might shift where innovation occurs or where it is easier for people to invest money and resources in introducing products to the market. Now, it's okay to stop there and say that's a pretty big claim. In some ways, maybe we're overgeneralizing, right? Isn't uncertainty just a dilemma that all emerging technology faces, right? We have something that's new. We don't have a history of how it worked. It's being deployed in a new context. Shouldn't we expect this to be kind of similar? And there's a degree of truth to that, but my answer is that it probably is meaningfully different from many other contexts that we think about. Now, there's stronger and weaker cases for why this uncertainty might be different in the AI context, but on the left side here, I have the three strongest in my mind. The first is what people refer to two sort of overlapped concepts of Knightian uncertainty and deep uncertainty. That's to say that there's a difference between having uncertainty about something that you can measure, that you have a historical base rate of, and something that's you're uncertain about because you can't measure it, or you don't know exactly how it will develop. An analogy here would be something like when AVs are introduced to the market, or maybe better yet, we may be uncertain what the weather is tomorrow, but we model it. We have observed it over a considerable period of time. We have lots of data. We'd expect that our prediction is pretty good, even if we can't say that we can predict it with 100% certainty. On the other hand, for something like AI, where we're not even sure if systems will be useful in a new context or how agentic they'll be overall, you can't make those same type of predictions. Another way that this uncertainty is unique is in terms of variance, right? On one side of the spectrum, we have predictions that AI systems will largely look like they do today. Sort of nothing new to see here. On the other end, we're talking about fundamentally shifting how we do economic activities, how we govern ourselves. We're talking about something that's more akin to the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. And that's a really big category of possible outcomes. Something that we wouldn't see from something, say, in another AI context, autonomous vehicles, where the range of options is maybe something between marginally useful products that are somewhat deployed, they're not particularly economically valuable, but they produce something, to, oh, they work pretty well and we use them and they in fact displace one narrow area of labor or create different jobs. Here, one of the option spaces that isn't available there is that the AVs fundamentally shape how we do scientific research in the future and whether we develop new modes of transportation, right? We're talking about considerably more variance here. And related to that, the last category I'll go over here is that we get considerable category changes depending on what the trajectory of AI looks like. If advances are mostly happening in, say, narrow models, in biological design tools or something like that, we could see a ton of disruption in one narrow industry without having large effects on society overall. On the other end, we could have general purpose systems that are disrupting across the economy. So what if now you're still not convinced that this is particularly, that uncertainty is a particular dilemma for AI policy? Well, I think a narrower claim still works here. It's to say that even if you think that AI will develop much more similarly to other typical or normal technologies, it still is the foundational design constraint that we're dealing with now. So even when we take examples like algorithmic discrimination or medical harms or other things, today we don't have consensus around the best practices. We struggle to measure what the actual harms are. And there's a lot of work to be done on basic questions around information gathering and development of best practices. Additionally, at the very least, there's not political consensus on what the diagnosis of the problem is or what the best practices to implement are. And so in that realm, you probably have to come up with some sort of policy intervention that multiple parties with multiple different views of what the trajectory of the technology might be would be willing to accept. So that leads me to the second part of this talk, which is what's the available option space? And as all talks, this will be a little bit reductive. So apologies in advance, and we can go into nuances in the Q&A. But on a very basic level, one option is to wait, right? We don't have enough information. Let's figure it out in the future. The other is, no, we know enough and harms are materializing now. We have enough of a direction. Let's lock things in now. And the other is to focus on this category of optionality that I'll get into later. And what I'm gesturing at here is something that the literature often refers to as a pacing problem. That if you act too soon with respect to an emerging technology, you're likely to be wrong. You're likely to lock in the wrong thing. You're likely to look back and say, oh, we didn't have all the information we needed. On the other hand, if you wait, government will struggle to catch up. Maybe two case studies that are instructive here would be, on the one hand, something like nuclear power in the US in the mid-20th century, where we impose a regulatory regime that in the long term maybe deters a technology from developing and maybe has large impacts for environmental harms in the near future. And on the other end, you have something like social media, where by waiting, you end up in a position where government doesn't have the competency or knowledge to regulate the domain. They don't know what they're doing. We haven't invested considerable effort in figuring those questions out. One might ask within this, well, if I don't think that AI progress is going to be particularly promising, do I really care about this pacing problem? Right? So if we think that future AI systems will be particularly powerful, then yeah, we're worried that we might fall behind or that we might lock in the wrong thing short term. If I'm kind of pessimistic that future AI progress will be meaningful, why do I need to prepare for that world? Well, I think that even under that view, you probably still do care about the optionality recommendations I'll make later in the presentation. And to help work that out, I've made, again, this sort of simplistic grid of the option space. On the top axis, you have how much desire you have to act, right? So either being patient and waiting for more information or being proactive. On the vertical axis, you have how optimistic you are about future developments in AI. And in each of these categories, you still care about developing information to make decisions in the future. In the top category for the patient optimist, you think that AI has huge upsides, but you think that all things considered, it's wise for the government to stay out of the way. So what you're optimizing for there is not sort of getting in the way of progress. For the patient pessimist, you don't think that there's anything that's going to happen in the future that's meaningfully different from now. You think that we already have most of the information that we need, and there's not really a reason to act. For the proactive optimist, you think that the risks are real and large. You expect sort of transformative impacts in the future, and you're drawn to some sort of comprehensive or strong governance regime. And for the proactive pessimist, you think the future isn't that different, but you do see current AI harms and you want swift and definitive actions. So going through each of those a little bit more, starting with the category and action, I think there's some useful insights that we can get from this category, right? So if you're pessimistic about future AI progress and you don't want to act, there's a chance that you're right and that you save government resources in that world, right? If progress is minimal, slow, or ordinary, the government doesn't really need to do much. It doesn't need to prepare itself. It'll handle things pretty well by default. If you're wrong in your prediction, and there's a good chance that you may be wrong, the government will be largely underprepared for future developments. I think in this position, under uncertainty, your best option is to choose an intervention that has less overall downside in the projected scenarios. Going over to the other category of patients, I think this one has some points that are probably right and that we should consider in our governance strategies. So the patient optimists maybe fall into two main categories when I'm talking with people. You have people who think that future AI progress will be very important. It's probably upside weighted. You think that it's more likely that it's going to be very useful to us. In order to achieve that, you're worried that the government will intervene too heavily, get in the way, stop AI systems from being integrated into useful products. And so you want something maybe close to a culture of permissionless innovation. There's also maybe another category here of people who are optimistic for future systems, but say that we just don't have enough evidence and so we should wait. They're a little bit less worried about innovation. They're a little bit more about epistemic rigor and evidence. I think both of these categories have some useful insights, right? So they're probably right that without more information, we're going to make poor decisions. We don't know best practices. We have limited ability to measure and understand the risks that we're talking about. And it's pretty likely that if we put in rigid constraints right now, that they'll become outmoded over time. Government is slow to update things. The technology is changing rapidly. There's probably going to be a mismatch at some point. I think both of these categories also do an admirable job of focusing on the upside benefits related to AI, right? It isn't just risk that matters. We want to see AI products that help society on the whole. But even if you're in this optimistic position, I think that there's still reason for some form of preparation for future advances. I think most basically, if you are projecting that AI systems will be very powerful and important and widely integrated across the economy, we should expect that the government will become involved at some point in time. And if that's the case, preparing to do a good job when that time comes makes sense. Like we said earlier, governments will also struggle to catch up to progress. They'll struggle to hire people with expertise. They'll struggle to gather information. And over time, especially if we think that systems will be quite capable, we'd expect that companies will gain increasing leverage. They'll have systems that allow them to do a lot of activity very quickly. They'll allow them to make better decisions. They will accumulate a large amount of resources. And we might think that in that world, government will have less leverage to take interventions at some future point. There's also a case that even if you care about innovation, there are different categories of innovation, right? You also care about safety innovation, right? Developing airbags and seatbelts being a classic example here. And that takes time. You need companies to be incentivized in the short term to be looking into what safer products might be. to be developing the practices to gather that information, and to otherwise sort of diffuse those safety innovations throughout the industry. There's also a case that if you don't have some form of government innovation, some sort of government intervention, that innovation in the future might be more heavily restricted in expectation. And why would that be? It would be because if you have large-scale harms that occur, you might expect that consumers and sort of political constituents will demand things that are harsher requirements, things that are closer to bans or restrictions on introducing AI products into new industries. And that might ultimately close off innovation in different areas. So putting that all together, I think in both cases, even if you are inclined to not acting, in either scenario, there are a lot of policies related to government capacity that still make sense under your own worldview. For those who are concerned about innovation, you're happy with policies that are light touch, that don't get in the way of you integrating products and releasing them to market. You're maybe more willing to share information or develop procedures, so long as they don't deter you from having sort of the people at your bleeding edge who are developing products doing their jobs. On the evidence seeker side of things, evidence-seeking policies or capacity-related policies are actually quite good. They help you get an answer sooner, and they help sort of resolve your foundational uncertainty. And on the pessimistic side, again, I think that it goes back to this sort of trade that you're making, that even if you are decently confident that there won't be future progress, there's a chance that you're wrong. If you are correct, the cost of building some sort of government capacity isn't particularly costly. It's some friction to society overall, it's some wasted money, but it's sort of constraining a technology or putting requirements on a technology that you aren't that hopeful for overall, and so those costs are less important. Going to the other side of the balance, you maybe have two primary categories of people who are on the more active side, right? So if you're pessimistic about future progress in AI, but you want to act, usually that suggests that you think that current systems are already doing some sort of harm, right? So you're not worried about future systems, you don't think that they'll be that capable, but you have some motivation to action. That's often because you think that there's something already observable that's going wrong. On the other end of things, for those who want to be proactive and are more optimistic about future development, this is often where you find people who are concerned about mitigating existential or catastrophic risk, right? They think that there's a narrow pathway to success, they think there are large-scale risks, and that merits some sort of precautionary action or preparation. Now, while I think both of these are sort of noble inclinations, they both have their own limitations too, as we reviewed in the last part, right? We don't have the information to make wise decisions. We don't have best practices that are already developed to implement. On the pessimistic side, if you don't think that future technology will look that different, it's maybe vexed a little bit less by these questions of uncertainty. It's less of a barrier. You're able to observe harms that are happening, say, in a medical context or in a housing context or something. Your main interest there is that you need to be able to better measure those things, right? So you can identify them so that you can better develop best practices. You also probably should care about the innovation sort of upside of AI, right? You're not just caring about downside risk. You think that future systems won't be particularly powerful, but you think that current ones do matter. And you probably want them to produce products that are widely accessible and valuable, say in the medical or healthcare context. On the side of things where you're proactive and you're optimistic about future development, I think this is basically the converse of the patient optimist scenario. You're constrained by the lack of information that you have in your expertise. There's also a good case that some of the best safety work that you can do will only be able to happen once systems are more developed and that you'll be much more capable of doing it. And you're going to have a really hard time getting political consensus to put in place some sort of hard limitations for risks that haven't materialized yet. There's not a strong track record of sort of proactive regulation, and most people don't buy your core premise that things will be transformative in the future such that they're not motivated to act. So skipping ahead a bit, this brings me to the core sort of proposal of this presentation, that given all of those design constraints, optionality makes a lot of sense. What do I mean by optionality? I think there's a couple core pieces that you want to track. The first one is that you want to have choices. So you want to have multiple distinct options that you're able to select from. This is maybe a creativity exercise as much as it is a descriptive exercise, right? You want to be able to come up with a number of different ways the government can respond to situations and pick amongst them to choose the best one. You also want the government to have enough power or authority to actually make those choices, right? So if they get crowded out by industry players that have vastly more knowledge than them or vastly more control in the economy, you're not actually able to make those choices even if you can think about them or have someone research them. You also need knowledge. Some of this is about facts on the ground, right? You need to actually be observing harms. You need them to be reported to you. And some of this is about general expertise, right? You need people who are able to process that information and make sound decisions. And lastly, you need enough time to put all of that information and knowledge together. One of the big constraints on government is that people often have portfolios that include a number of different things, that you don't have a team that's set aside to sort of deliberate and make informed policy decisions in the future. And on the congressional side, things are often sort of worked out through some sort of political process. So even if government has a lot of information and capacity, it might not have a space or the environment to make informed decisions. So why do we think that form of optionality, having more choices, having the ability to exercise them, having enough knowledge to analyze them, and time to do that sort of analysis, why is that valuable? Going back to the beginning of the presentation, the biggest point is that it's epistemically useful, right? We'll be better informed if we have more information, if we have better decision-making processes. We'll be able to make better decisions. The other is this political point. If you have people who considerably disagree on the trajectory of a technology and considerably disagree over the risk of getting in the way of innovation, you have to choose options that are relatively light touch, that can get multiple people to be invested in them. And because optionality sort of overall raises the sanity line, it gives everyone information to make better informed decisions, it's pretty appealing to a large variety of coalitions. Going back to the chart from earlier, we kind of see this in each of the categories, right? So for people who are interested primarily in optimizing for upside innovation, you mostly just care about light touch things that don't get in the way. For those who are evidence seeking, you just want information to make better decisions. For those who are worried about sort of larger or future risks, you really are troubled by the amount of uncertainty that you have, and you want more information to make decisions, and you can't get political consensus from people to advance your goals. For those who are focused on existing or current harms while being pessimistic about the future, you still need to measure the harms that are happening and use that information to make informed decisions about best practices. Maybe the hardest category out of all of this is those who are just foundationally pessimistic about future progress. But there again, I would just defer to, you'd have to be rather confident about that. And the downside risk to you investing in government capacity is relatively low, such that it seems like a good bet. So now to get into sort of, hopefully, the meat of the presentation, or the most useful thing, especially to some of the lawyers and law students in the room. A lot of our research at LawAI is focused on working out the specifics of the different ways that you can increase optionality. Now, this is an initial taxonomy. We're still sort of working it out. In any good taxonomy, you want the categories to sort of be independent and not overlapped. And I can't quite promise that with this one here. But I think it's at least a useful thinking aid of the different categories that you want to think about in increasing government optionality. So we've already gone over some of these: information, capacity, decision making. But there's a few additional ones that I'll go through in the next couple of slides. So thinking about information first, your goal is that you want government to have enough information to make quality decisions. And your main considerations there are not just the quality of the information, but how freely it's shared, between industry and government. There's a barrier between the most up-to-date or the most useful information getting to actual decision makers. In order for industry to feel comfortable sharing that information, there probably needs to be some trait of security, promising not to reveal confidential information or trade secrets. You also want that information to be trustworthy, right? You can only get so far with a company reporting on its own practices. That's helpful. But you might want some sort of trusted third party to gather that information as well. Now, within that, there's a couple different categories that I want to flag. The first one is basic awareness. And maybe this seems simple, but it's something that we still have work to do on the sort of government capacity side of things. This is basic requirements just of indicating that you are engaging in a training run, indicating that you possess a certain amount of compute, reporting that you are introducing a product into some sort of covered industry or area. The goal here isn't to place prescriptive requirements, but to give a cataloging to government of what the targets of regulation might be. Now, one step beyond that is gaining information about the current state of the art. This is both about the capabilities of systems as they're coming out and about the risks that they might pose. Now, a lot of common proposals around this relate to third-party testing and evaluations. It may, at sort of like a higher level, involve some sort of pre-deployment access to frontier models by those third parties rather than after the fact. You also might care about information about a company's planning or procedures. So rather than requiring that, or a step short of requiring that a company develop a certain safety practice or procedure, you can at the very least require them to report that they are developing an emergency plan or are developing a plan and a chain of command to provide information about adverse events to people within the company and ultimately to the government. There's a chance that making these sort of procedural requirements will be relatively light touch because they don't stop you from integrating products or introducing them to the market. But they do sort of incentivize some amount of pre-thinking or planning from an actor who's well positioned to do it, which is the company. You also might want to think about how you share that information, both between agencies within the government and between agencies and companies. And you might want to think about ways to standardize how that information is gathered, whether it's data or reports, so that people can easily analyze it, whether it's researchers or the government. You also might want to develop ways to generate new information or detect new information. Specifically here, I highlight monitoring, where you might want to have some sort of adverse event reporting system or whistleblower protections. Going into a little bit of depth, maybe just to show where I think that there's opportunities for lawyers and law students to provide some color here. On whistleblower protections, the case for them is essentially that you'll often have people within the company being the first ones to identify risks, right? And they'll be best positioned to provide that information. By default, they might be overly nervous to provide that information because they expect either that their employer will sue them for providing it, either under contract or under trade secret law, that they might have some sort of a contractual agreement that says that they're not allowed to disclose that information. And so you might want government to intervene in some way that says, no, we're going to protect whistleblowers. As for where the legal analysis comes in there, there's questions about what existing law covers. There's figuring out whether you just sort of the scope of coverage, whether you're just covering violations of law or generally covering perceived risks to public safety and exactly how you specify that, how you restrict the disclosure of trade secrets. And if you don't think that even with sort of a liability shield that reporters might come forward, you might want to think about processes in government that might allow the government to solicit that information or better use it, or you might want to think about monetary incentives. On the next one, capacity. This is about personnel and expertise in order to use that information. And the main consideration here is that it's quite difficult for a government to hire top talent. I don't have really sort of innovative or new thoughts here. There's a large literature on the dilemma of hiring talent within government. But I think especially in the AI context, maybe the areas where we can make the most progress is thinking about ways to creatively use existing authorities to have a hiring search, thinking about ways to create sort of external funding mechanisms. People have talked about sort of a NIST foundation or something like that that would allow NIST to hire people outside of the general civil service process. You might also want to think about ways that wouldn't require you to hire that expertise in-house, right? This could look like safety boards or sort of expert consultation groups. But I think the ultimate goal is that you end up with something that isn't just a working group of people who generally are consulted and put out a report, but the government can actually rely on in making its decisions. When it comes to decision making, outline a couple more categories here too. If you want to use your capacity well and you have enough information, you still need an environment or procedures that allow you to sort of act rationally within that. It's often quite hard to reason about emerging technology, and so we might expect that it will only go mediocrely by default. There are a couple ways to do that. Some revolve around sort of setting up infrastructure, setting aside specific teams who are tasked with updating things or specifically tasked with doing a periodic review. You might want to develop tools that better enable government to measure things, or analysis frameworks, for example, making tweaks around the benefit cost analysis. And you might want to, generally think about the environment that you're creating. In the environmental context, there are at least some examples of agencies setting aside specific teams who are tasked with doing periodic reviews and clearing their plates of other tasks, such that they have the space to actually make informed decisions and that they don't have competing priorities. One consideration I haven't talked about as much so far is also that you would want to make whatever rules you put in place or whatever governance regime you put in place to be updatable or adaptable over time. And I mean that both in terms of the rules that you're imposing and the category of your the target of your regulation overall, right? So you might want flexible definitions that enable you to over time update the category of models or companies that are governed. You might want to enable agencies to update their regulations more frequently. And you might want corporations to be in a position where they can make commitments before they're exactly sure of the facts on the ground. There's a bit of a literature on the concept of sort of if-then commitments. So rather than agreeing to a safety protocol in advance, you agree to a safety protocol conditional on certain facts coming to be. So if in fact we get a certain breakthrough in the capabilities of a model, we will then do this, or we will agree to have a decision-making process at that point in time. Overall, the goal here is to just think about ways to make yourself more flexible and make it more likely that you update things over time so they don't become stagnant. You also want to think about response. So while updating is about responding to general trends that change over time or new information, maybe what I mean in this category is responding to concrete harms that you've observed out in the world. So you get reports of adverse events. How quickly can the government respond? How do they get the information? How prepared is the company to gather information that's necessary for them to quarantine a model, to patch an error or difficulty, to otherwise adjust its conduct to mitigate further harms from occurring? You also might want to think about coordination. And this goes between a number of different actors, right? You want industry and government to be able to coordinate on agreements, including voluntary ones. You want the US and other nations to be able to coordinate on safety commitments and be able to potentially trade benefits in exchange for that. And you want researchers to be able to access information both from the government and from industry. Another tool that you might think about for optionality is relying on sort of market incentives that adjust themselves over time rather than being prescriptive. Some that people talk about frequently are liability and insurance. As I'll go through here, one of the main benefits of liability, or a few of them, are that it naturally is proportional to the harms that occur in the world, right? You get a damage award in proportion to the harms that resulted. It's flexible. You don't have to put requirements on the front end. Instead, you impose some sort of penalty or injunction once things happen in the world. It requires also less political consensus because you have a developed common law system in the background that can adjudicate some of these things. And it's naturally sort of fact-bound, right? You don't need to agree to a bunch of future hypothetical situations. You'll adjudicate the things once the actual harm occurs. There are a bunch of open questions within liability around judgment proofness and sort of other societal costs that might result from this, but I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And the last thing that you might want to think about for optionality is just overall putting the government in a position in which it maintains control. One of the key vulnerabilities here would be something like if you have inadequate cybersecurity, the government may not actually have the option to control how systems are released or how data is provided to the public. So in order to maintain your ability to implement some of your best practices and policies, you have to foundationally assure that you actually have control over the thing that you're regulating. So a brief review and upshots, and then we'll go into Q&A. I think there are a number of different practices that can put the government in a better position to make good decisions. Some of them relate to information and expertise. Others relate to making your decisions faster, more flexible, more responsive to facts that emerge on the ground, or relying on sort of market incentives to adjust to things over time. There's also within each of those categories a number of different things that lawyers are well positioned to do. There's a lot of just simple specification questions where you have to figure out what information and who it's given to and under what authority. There's some design questions that benefit from knowing about similar regulatory systems in the past that maybe involved safety boards or decision-making systems that involved updating regulations more frequently or periodically. And then there's also just some hard law questions around liability and contracts. Going back to the sort of core claims here, I hope that the presentation has made a decent case that uncertainty is a dilemma for governing AI, and that overall optionality is a good choice for managing that uncertainty, for building some sort of political consensus that allows you to move forward. Okay, questions?
Thank you. My question for you is, throughout the presentation, you referred to the government as one singular entity, and I'm sure that you have thoughts on this. Within the federalist system that we exist in, do you see that playing as a positive or a detriment to this philosophy of optionality? And how can we kind of navigate incorporating that both into the federal but also state systems?
Yeah, maybe adding even one more layer, you'd want to think about international actors, and right, countries have different levels of capacity or skill. And so the answer is probably something about role differentiation, right? So when you're thinking on the international scale, there are some countries that don't house frontier AI companies, but they would be able to potentially do some forms of research, right? They'd be able to investigate, say, cybersecurity best practices, or they might be able to invest in some sort of infrastructure or compute governance type things. When we're talking about the federalist system here, I think similarly, there's a strong case that states are well positioned to invest in research, especially research that either advances safety or advances sort of integration into pro-social context in which it might not be the most sort of financially valuable thing for AI companies to invest in, but is nonetheless valuable. There's also a good case that just individual states are going to matter a ton here, right? California, if California, they already have decent whistleblower protection, so I don't want to sort of poo-poo that. But were they to clarify, as they're talking about in SB 53 right now, Scott Wiener's bill, that you could report not just violations of law, but likely risks to public safety. And they were to establish some sort of process for the state to gather that information and to share it, I think that'd be quite useful, right? You'd get it to one of the most relevant actors, and if they handle it well internally, they would be able to provide it to others. So yeah, it does add some complication having these different actors, but because you don't need all tasks to be done by one entity, and there's a possibility to share information, you can have some role differentiation.
Is there anything you'd like to expound upon?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think some things that maybe like we could talk about it chronologically. Thanks, Jake. Some of these things I think can move in the immediate future, right? There's appetite on both the state and on the federal level for whistleblower protections, and there are just a bunch of sort of concrete, narrow questions to be worked out there, especially around sort of trade secrets and around the possibility of setting up some sort of either hotline or process within government to handle that information and share it. So some of those things will make progress. On the sort of maintaining control side of things, I think that we could see some actual or meaningful sort of cybersecurity investment or coordination in the short term. There's probably less legal questions there, although we have done some work on sort of the existing authorities that could be used in an executive order to do that. So those are some of the priorities for now. And then some of the things that we're figuring out sort of in the meantime would be how to adjust liability expectations, how to set up rules for government deployment of agents and other things. I think maybe one sub-implication of focusing on optionality is something like, in the short term, focus on gathering information and preparing yourself, and also do some work that is forecasting out where we might be 12 to 18 months. And there's a chance that that work won't be particularly useful, but in expectation is a good bet, right? You want to like develop 12 or 15 or something of that different proposals or working through different legal questions that could result from different sort of trajectories of AI progress so that you're ready for those scenarios. And you buy yourself some time to do that by sort of developing these background capacity things. Yeah.
Thank you. On the slide, you talked about organizations like, or agencies like NIST being able to hire more and better. In the current climate, in terms of how much kind of hiring is being cut and people are being fired from government, is that a kind of longer term goal? Like, is that, you know, after perhaps this term of the presidency? And is that too long to wait?
Yeah. A couple layers of questions there. So first one is, yeah, like we're on, there were multiple trajectories that we could have seen Doge go on, right? There's a version that would have been quite promising, that would have been make government nimble, make it better able to hire people who are highly competent, make it better able to make decisions quickly and other things. That's not the trajectory we ended up on. It's really disappointing. It's sort of like from this sort of like value pluralism perspective, from many people in the admin's own worldviews or perspectives, it would have been good to hire competent people. It would have been good to not lay off a bunch of people in the CHIPS office. But that's not where we're at. So yes, some of this is a call for states and other countries for building this capacity. Some of that capacity can be built outside of government, so standard setting bodies or sort of voluntary agreements between companies that help develop those standards over time. Those things can happen in the absence of government. Public-private partnerships, things that don't require them being internal, right? So advisories and other things, or just working on projects such that you're having more regular interaction, those things are still feasible. But you are right that like some of this is a play for the future. And then maybe the question there is something like, you said, is it too long to wait? My inclination generally, and you know, others might disagree with me, I don't speak for my institution, is something like most policy interventions are most useful where we get sort of multiple bites at the apple, where we have opportunities to learn and make good decisions. Like if in fact the world is so fragile that progress is going to take off really fast, that things will get locked in quickly, that we won't have a lot of leverage. It's probably a small number of people who actually have leverage in those worlds. And so generally policy is not just sort of optionality. Like policy interventions generally, I'd be quite pessimistic that they're useful there. And so at least what I tell myself is something like, you are making these like probabilistic bets for many scenarios where things either develop more slowly or moderately slowly or other things. You're putting yourself in a better spot.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lilian. I had a short question. So following the logic of the radical optionality and this uncertainty, right? What's the outlook here when we talk about regulation? Is it more like overarching federal principles, or we go, let's say, industry-wise? So in terms of data, right? If we take GDPR, in Europe, it was like a general principle that would apply top-down, where in the US, we have an industry data kind of privacy legal frameworks. So with radical optionality and with uncertainty, which logic would you think we should follow?
Yeah, I think there's also a bunch of background considerations that inform this, right? So it's just less likely in the US that you're going to get some sort of comprehensive package. That's not often how things work. If we do get something that's more comprehensive, it's probably going to be a bunch of separate bills that are packaged together or something. So just as a historical expectation of how it will go, it's not likely that we would end up with something like the EU AI Act that's comprehensive. In terms of focus, so there are some things that should be sectoral and there are other things that should be general, right? So in fact, the information that you want to gather for, say, use of AI in the healthcare context, it's like a specific set of actors, right? You either want hospitals or insurers or someone to be gathering it. You want to specify what that specific information is. Like the actor who's most positioned to do that is probably that's in their portfolio, right? They're experts. On the other hand, for these general purpose systems, it's really hard to predict where they'll be consequential, and they may be consequential in a bunch of areas at once. And they do require perhaps a higher level of sort of understanding of where the frontier of models are at, because the most interesting questions or intervention points relate to the foundational architecture of the models and what they can do. In a way that when you're talking about sort of integrated products that are in the healthcare context, it's often enough to know what the sort of what the standard of care is already and how successful that is, right? If you can generally measure and do a good job of evaluating standard practice, you can treat AI very similar to a new drug or something else, and you don't really need to understand. The AI is just one of many tools. So that's to say, I expect it'll probably be a mix. For a lot of these sort of more transformative things, I think you'll probably need something that's cross-sectoral. Yeah, and luckily maybe that's also part of this optionality pitch is that some of the things that most fit that sort of cross-sectoral model is general gathering information, competency, other things, and that better prepares you than sort of putting in individual prescriptions.
Oh, thank you. From our virtual audience, this person really liked the nuclear power versus social media example for kind of comparison, but wanted to know if there were examples where optionality has proven effective for governing other technologies. I'm curious about the challenges of that approach.
Yeah. That's a good question, and I wish I had my colleague Charlie, who's been doing a lot of that sort of historical case study research on hand. My guess would be, so when you look at the development of health policy within HHS and other things, that I don't know the exact history of that, right? But there's a hiring out process, and then over time, as you specialize, right, then you create things like when you're you want to understand not just infectious disease generally, but you want to understand medical and physical PPE that can intervene in pandemics. And so you create something like BARDA, and then you figure out how to hire a bunch of people who are competent and how to share them with, yeah. So I don't know all of the specific examples, but this seems like something that's probably happened, especially in the healthcare context and probably some others.
And one last question.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. So I follow her question about the gathering information and data accuracy, data consistent with reality. So the data always change, particularly following time series, different time, the different data always change. So how do you think we can different time, different subject, we can consider different error rate? So co-efficiency rate. So if we put different data, gathering different information, and sometimes also disinformation or misleading information, so that obviously could generate huge uncertainty, not only optionality, but huge uncertainty. But this data, if this time change, we can find some the rule and the law for the time series. And we can find the error rate, co-efficiency rate. How do we think this, if open AI system or in hospital, the AI system, make analysis according to different data. They also can find some like error rate or coefficient rate or some definite criteria scenarios. So
Yeah, if I understand your question right, so there's always a dilemma when you're doing data analysis of sort of specifying what you're measuring in the first place, and also for controlling for a bunch of other things that vary over time. You might especially expect with sort of an emerging technology that the thing that you're deploying is changing over time as you're measuring things. So I think that's right. And I would just say, I guess, like, that's more similar to dilemmas that we deal with in a bunch of other contexts. And it's much easier to reason, even under imperfect information, if you are measuring those things in analyzing them. Yeah, so it won't always be perfect, but it's better than the status quo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today.